Hello, welcome to the April Public Forum video topic analysis for Champions Briefs. This is a wonderful topic. It's very, very broad, very, very complex, and for that reason, I strongly recommend that in addition to watching this video, you take a look at the brief itself. In this brief, you'll find far more in-depth arguments and more cards than I can provide in this video, and it'll surely be a great help for you in preparation for whatever tournament or whatever competition you might be having this month. So I think that the first thing that I'd like to say in this topic analysis is that if you haven't already, before you even start thinking about arguments, and if you've already started, take a second to do this. Do some really in-depth and meaningful research into the key historical and political aspects of the topic. It's very complex, and it can be sometimes difficult to come up with arguments on your own without having a very solid foundational understanding of the situation at hand. So, for example, something that I recommend you do is maybe read about the history of the Middle East. Perhaps read about the history of the United States' involvement in the Middle East. Perhaps read about other examples of where the United States has a military presence, and what this presence looks like, and how this presence has panned out in the past. So, with that said, once you have a solid basis of understanding, and once you have basically your tools that you can work with, then you can start to think about what the topic is really about, and then it becomes a lot easier to really brainstorm ideas for arguments. And this is especially important on this topic, again, because of how complex it really is, and because of how difficult it is to have the facts straight to begin with, because there are many competing narratives. With that said, we can jump in a bit here based on some very basic things that we know are going to be true about the region, and then basically hypothesizing from there, and then beyond that, verification of these arguments will need to be done with further research. The first question we need to ask ourselves, though, is what exactly is military presence, right? So military presence is a vague term, and it can mean many, many things, and I think that in order to narrow down arguments that we can make about the military presence, it's important to first understand what it is we are talking about. First, because it means that we're not taking shots in the dark, but second, because it allows us to make even more specific arguments, right, where we can make arguments about particular types of military presence. You could have a whole contention just about one particular thing that the U.S. does in the Middle East, one particular type of military presence. So let's jump into it, right? So just a few things off the bat that come to mind, right, are one, troop bases, right? This is a very obvious one, right? Probably conventionally what we think about when we think about military presence is literal people on the ground with weapons, with the potential to fight if they need to. Other examples are things like special operations, right, where we send out small groups of soldiers to conduct very specific types of missions, like for example the SEAL Team 6 that killed Osama bin Laden, things of this nature, right? Another example of military presence might be drone strikes, right? These are unmanned vehicles that fly and then drop bombs and fire missiles at terrorist leaders. Another example is military aid, right? Arguably also another form of military presence. We give money directly to the militaries of certain countries in the Persian Gulf, as well as providing weapons themselves, selling weapons to them, which perhaps might be even another form of military presence in the form of just selling them weapons. They give us money, we give them weapons. Other examples might be sort of advising, right? We train troops, we give intelligence, we collect intelligence, many, many different things that we do in the Middle East, right, in order to have a military presence there. So when coming up with arguments, given how broad the topic is, a good, easy way to start would be to think to yourself, okay, let me take one of these types of military presence and I'll work from there. So for example, think to yourself, okay, what are the pros, what are the cons of having a troop base, right, in a particular region? What are the pros, what are the cons of drone strikes? Pros, cons of weapon sales. And then from there, it can be a lot easier to make more concrete arguments about the nature of the military presence without needing to tackle the resolution as a whole, right? this is an easy way to kind of jump into the topic without needing to know too much. You can just become a specialist in one thing, and you'd be surprised how far that can really take you at even the most competitive tournaments. Okay, so with that said, I think that that's one way you can easily jump into the topic. The second way that you can easily jump into the topic is to start from impacts and work your way back to the resolution, right? So the previous way that is described is to start from the resolution, that is to start with the different types of military presence and then to work to construct your arguments that way. But a second way you can do it is to work backwards, to say, I want to impact to terrorism, or I want to impact to political stability, or corruption, right? Just a few examples. I'm going to go through what I think are the 4 main types of impacts that you're going to be seeing on this topic. I think that this is perhaps the best way you can prepare for this topic and coming up with arguments, because the impacts are so intertwined in ways that they aren't necessarily on other topics. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a second, but what's important to keep in mind is how do all of these impacts, how do all of these endgame scenarios interact with one another, right? Because that's where you're going to be getting the crux of your strategy. That's where you're going to be getting the crux of your weighing. Once you know how the impacts interact with each other, then you can design a strategy accordingly to say that, oh, terrorism is the most important thing because blank, right? Because it links into every other impact in this way, and to prepare that accordingly. So enough beating around the bush. Let's get into the 4 different things. First, I think is going to be a sort of global recession type impact, right? So a sort of impact that branches out from the Middle East and affects countries across the world, right? So there are a lot of tensions, there are a lot of relationships that these Middle Eastern countries have with other countries around the world, and likewise there are a lot of relationships that the United States has with other countries around the world, right? So an impact to either an oil supply in the Middle East, or an impact to the United States economy as a result of our military presence being there, could have potential ramifications across the globe, right? The impact of this then, of course, can affect everything that goes on in the Middle East, from terrorism to local governments to the economy, right? Because all of these things are definitely dependent on the state, on the status of the global economy, or on the status of the United States military capacity in general, right? Or, for example, the Arab states in general, their general state of affairs, right? So the first sort of impact is one that pertains to a sort of from in to outward impact that applies to the whole world. This could be appealing because it has a very large scope. It can also be appealing because it probably will be able to link into almost anything else given how big it is. The downside is that, of course, this impact is going to have probably a low probability, right? Because the bigger the impact gets, obviously, the smaller the probability, the smaller the chance that any one given action is going to affect that and cause that to happen. A global recession happens a lot of times anyway, right? We're probably experiencing one right now, and regardless of what happens in the Middle East, it's unlikely that that's really going to be the tipping point, given how many factors are at play, right? So for the same reason that it is a good impact, it's also a bad impact. It affects so many things, but also so many things affect it, so it's hard to isolate. The second impact I want to talk about is terrorism, right? So this is a really big impact in 2 ways, right? First, probably the first thing that comes to mind, right, is the number of lives directly lost from terrorism, right? So terrorism kills thousands of people every year, especially in these countries that are war-torn, and it's just directly from attacks people are dying, right? But the far bigger impact from terrorism comes from the long-term structural ramifications of violence in the region, right? So it's not just that terrorism kills people directly, but because terrorism, for example, destroys roads, for example, destroys hospitals, it makes it difficult for a region to grow economically and developmentally in the long term, which loses lives later on, right? So like if a whole region is now condemned to poverty because they now don't have roads, or because their main thoroughfare has now been destroyed by a terrorist attack, that can take years to recuperate the losses from, and that can take years to ever develop to a point beyond that, right? Or rebuild this. It can even be forever lost, the sort of economic potential that used to exist, which means that people are left living in poverty, are left without basic necessities, which will, if the terrorist attack didn't kill them directly, that will, right? It's just a matter of time. So the developmental and long-term impact of terrorism are something to truly be reckoned with, and as such, it allows you to link into any economic impacts or any governmental impacts that happen as well, right? Because the economy is obviously deeply affected by violence and deeply affected by infrastructure damage, but the governance is also deeply affected by this, right? Because if there's more instability, more terrorism, this means that the government has a harder time enforcing laws. It means that the government has to focus on defeating the terrorists because that's such a big concern, and instead cannot focus on other things that we take for granted in the United States, like, for example, social programs or public education, right? These services become increasingly difficult to deliver when there's more terrorism to contend with, right? So there are huge impacts politically, right, and also huge impacts economically, right? When you're thinking about terrorism, it's important also to, and because it has such wide-reaching impacts, it might also be important to consider what the root causes of terrorism are, right? So just because you might make an argument about how the United States is able to kill terrorists directly, or maybe even make the argument on the other side about how the United States military presence antagonizes terrorists, it increases recruitment, right? This doesn't necessarily touch the root cause of terrorism, which would likely remain true either way. It's just that this becomes the new scapegoat for people to join terrorists, or it doesn't actually make a meaningful dent into terrorism right now, which brings me to the two other sorts of impacts I'd like to talk about, which are political changes, or i.e. or governmental changes, and possibly economic changes, right? So politics has a big role that it plays in instability, terrorism, and just the general well-being of a populace, obviously, because a lot of times the reason why people join terrorist groups to begin with is because they find that there's no other way for them to have their voices heard in the government. And so they resort to violent means as a method of change, right? If you can't express your views through the government because there's no voting process, because there's more corruption, right? This means that your last chance is to join a terrorist organization, or at least the calls of terrorist organizations, the beckoning calls become a little bit more appealing because you have grievances and because you want them to be heard and because you want changes to happen. And a lot of times terrorist organizations actually do provide, can provide jobs to people and can provide a sense of stability, a sense of meaning that perhaps is missing from a lot of people's lives because of the political deterioration. The other thing I want to talk about, of course, is the economy, right? So the economy can also have a big impact on terrorism because it means that if you're in a more desperate situation, if you have nothing to lose, then you have nothing to lose. Then if a terrorist organization in any way seems appealing to you, right, there seems to be little reason not to join, right? Or at least there becomes less and less of a reason not to join because you have less to begin with. And so any change to your situation perhaps would be better than your current situation. And on the other hand, you could argue that actually a better economy, but that only happens to an extent, right? On the other hand, you could argue that after a certain point, the deterioration of the economy actually does not lead to an increase in terrorism, right? Because if people are too hungry, if people are too sick, then they can't do the demanding labor that is required to become a terrorist. So it goes both ways. And it's difficult to evaluate where exactly that tipping point is, but that being said, there's compelling arguments to be made on both sides, right? So you can see how all of these impacts are sort of enmeshed and entangled in one another, right? And so I think it's very important when constructing your arguments to sort of pick one of these things and to talk about it in a lot of depth and to talk about it in a lot of specificity as to how exactly your arguments are going to affect it, and then accordingly how the change in that impact is going to cause changes in other impacts, right? So what it allows you to do is you can concede to all of the arguments that your opponents are making, right? For example, if you're talking about economic changes and they're talking about political changes, you can concede that, you know, the the government becomes more representative, becomes more democratic as a result of U.S. presence. But if U.S. presence makes the economy worse, well, then people will still not have faith in the government, because the government because despite the best efforts of the government, the economy is still bad and their quality of life is still bad, which means that people are still inclined to join terrorist organizations, because even if it's true that they could express their voice in the government, that doesn't mean that the government is actually making any changes, while the terrorists are providing them with a real hard check that they can get in their mail every month if they provide them with work, right? So like, that's just one example of how you can see how you could possibly construct a sort of weighing mechanism. I can't go through all the different arguments that can be made here, right? Weighing every single one of these four things against each other, but at least you see the beginnings of something here, the beginnings of different ways that you can construct arguments. So I highly urge you to start here, and it'll give you a very, very good and effective strategy. Right. So I've talked a lot about strategy, but I'd like to talk a little bit about just a few ways that we possibly might be able to link into some things on both sides, right? And so I think that the one thing that I really want to point out, because I think that it can be really easy to get lost in the weeds on topics like this, right? And to start making very long link chains, to start to make very complex arguments, and sort of lose track of the bigger picture. So I want to just touch on what I think are the most obvious and the most simple arguments you can make on both sides. And again, simplicity is always a favorable thing, because a shorter link chain means it's harder to respond to, and it means that it's a stronger link, stronger probability into the impact. And if you can make a compelling argument for what the impact is, if you can do the weighing that I described earlier, then the shorter link chain is better for you. So what's the most obvious thing on the pro side, right? Why do we want to get rid of military presence? Well, it's obvious that in the past, the U.S. military presence has increased anti-U.S. sentiment. It has possibly increased the amount of terrorism that occurs in these regions, right? For so many reasons. One, because, people dislike the fact that the U.S. is getting militarily involved in their region, right? Possibly because they are destroying things themselves. When we bomb things with drones, we are destroying things in the same way that terrorists destroy things, right? And so it can be easier to sort of blame the United States than it is to blame terrorists who live in your community. At least you have some sort of relationship to them, whereas the United States seems far more foreign and easier to blame for the problems that are coming, right? So it means that people are more likely to join terrorist organizations than to join forces with the U.S. against their neighbors. Another thing is that possibly people don't like the fact that the United States is increasing its involvement with the state, right? And so because the United States is helping so many of these states politically and militarily, it means that people lose faith in the government, which would lead people to join terrorist organizations, kind of for the reason that I described earlier, right? So this means that people are more likely to recruit for terrorist organizations. There's a higher number of people who are terrorists than there were before U.S. presence, which is a reason why we might want to get out of there. Furthermore, I think the easiest and simplest argument on this side is certainly that United States presence destroys roads, destroys infrastructure, just as the militant terrorists do, and the impact is just as large, if not larger, because we have even more weapons than terrorists do. So just to lay out a few of the most obvious arguments there, very short, very easy link chains. I urge you to look into them further. And then on the con, just to run through a few obvious things here, right? The most obvious thing is that we help defeat terrorists. It's pretty simple, right? We train troops that can make sure that troops in these countries can now go out and defeat terrorists on their own. We collect data and information, intelligence that otherwise would never have been known, which can allow us to make more pinpointed, targeted attacks. We can, with drone strikes, kill the leaders of terrorist organizations, which means that even if it's true that there's going to be more recruitment, doesn't matter because there's no one at the top to sort of direct everything, and the brains of the operation has now been lost. We can do things like protect elections by putting troops outside of the polling places, which means that there's a higher respect for the government and a higher respect for the rule of law. That can go to solve back for the sort of root causes of the issue, right? But again, that even starts to get into territory that is far too long of a link chain. Might even be better just to stick to the basics, right? Just to say that we kill the terrorists and that defeats them. It's as simple as that. Like, I don't think you need to get fancy on this topic, especially when things are already so complicated, and especially when you know that opponents are going to be bringing in arguments that are so complicated. At least keep your side simple. So I understand I said a lot. There's still so much more to be said, so much more to be researched. That's why I urge you to look at the brief itself, with great topic analyses and great arguments carded themselves. But I hope you can see I'm excited for this topic. I hope you're excited for this topic. And happy debating. I wish you the best of luck.